end up at RMC?
I used to wonder that in my recruit year. Well, my father was a regular soldier. He was a major in my formative years. And though he never pushed an Army career, in fact, he didn't talk much about it. And in Ottawa in those days, the service people rarely wore a uniform. To me, he was just like any other businessman going off to work every day, and there was no military activity. But I think it goes back a little further than that, in that in my early childhood we were stationed at Rosedale Barracks in Toronto, and a very early memory I have is of standing in my cot and listening to the bugler play Reveille.
How interesting.
And it sort of lived with me. I didn't hear Reveille played on a bugle until I was a recruit at RMC. And we had a bugler who went out and made all the bugle calls in my day. So I sort of drifted into it, not so much as at that early stage as of making decisions to go, but not making any decision to go, just drifted along. However, contrary to the general thought at the time, or lack of thought, I believed in my teen years that war was inevitable and it was coming, and I'd better be in a position to prepare myself for it. This was totally contrary to all the peaceniks of their day. It didn't get discussed in our family table, not with me around anyway. And in the long run, towards my last years in high school, I worked harder than I'd ever worked in school before to ensure that I got there, to the extent that my mother and father went over for the coronation ceremonies in 1937. My father was I think he was called the Chief Administrative Officer of the Canadian contingent. Whatever it was, he was there as a soldier. And they assumed that I would go with them. And at one point at the dinner table, something came up, and I said, "Oh, I'm not going." It wasn't exactly said in rebellion, but it was going to be a rebellion if I just physically was not going. For one thing, I hated ocean travel. I was seasick beyond belief. And the other thing was I had to get a high result in my final year at high school. The school was empowered to give people like me a pass for senior matriculation, but they wouldn't give you a free pass with honors. And I knew that in Ontario there was only one way to get into RMC, and you had to have honors. Mm-hmm. And my parents, with great misgivings, left me with a house, a car, an arrangement for gasoline for the car, and I think they thought I'd make a complete botch of it. Well, they were wrong. I studied every possible moment I could all week long. I took a pot of tea up to my desk, and I'd be at my work until about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I came through with flying colors, and the next thing I knew, my father came home with a telegram saying, "You are now about to be a gentleman cadet at RMC." And I suddenly realized I'd brought all this on myself without quite realizing what I'd done. Well, it became apparent to me what I'd done on, I think it was the 3rd of September, 1937, when I arrived at RMC and was greeted by a number of gold-trimmed, brass-buttoned, black-booted seniors who explained in rapid fire that among the many things I could not do was set 1 foot on the square without running. They didn't mention that if I had to carry a trunk, I could walk around the square. Fortunately, my trunk didn't have very much in it. Anyway, I loaded this on my back and ran across the corner of the square to Fort Frederick Dormitory, now LaSalle Dormitory, and was thereby castigated for being such an idiot to try to carry a trunk across the and that was really the beginning of a year, an academic year, of thoroughgoing barracking and castigating and humiliating continually pretty well. And I really thought for a while, and considering all the work I'd put into getting there, it was a bit inhospitable of them not to recognize my I thought, sterling efforts, and shouldn't I be respected for this? And it turned out I wasn't going to be respected, but that's how I got to RMC.
Now, how did you, can you describe what it was like to be a first-year recruit?
Well, it was brainwashing, I guess you could call it nowadays. In our first week, other than some rudimentary drills and a lot of PT, and an extraordinary little time to change and to do various things, we began to measure time in minutes instead of half hours. And every evening we would be lined up as recruits under the clock on each level of what we called then the flats. I think they call them decks now. And we would be questioned about our knowledge of the college. For example, required to recite the names of the old 18 very rapidly, so rapidly that we learned to blur it. If you didn't know it, you just said blah, 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 like that, and it was assumed you'd said something. We were run across the square to report to CSM so-and-so about how stupid you were, and CSM so-and-so said, well, you must be pretty damn stupid. Go back and tell Sergeant so-and-so that I think you're stupid too, and come back and tell me what he said. So you'd be running back and forth across the square and playing tick-tock on the transom of the doors, where you had to jump up and grab that and then go tick-tock until told to stop or fall off, in which case you got further counseling. And if anybody actually passed out, which happened once or twice, so this was not that common, but, or perhaps fell and was a bit disoriented, or fell down the stairs, that was another thing. You had to run 2 steps at a time whenever you saw a stairway. And it was quite possible to trip and go down. So another recruit would be sent to get a wastebasket and fill it with water and throw it on you. That was the first aid that was rendered. Doing push-ups over a hot bath was another way of introducing us to the hardening and toughening of life. I'd say that the first year was unnecessarily hard. Yes, I could see the merits later of breaking us in and a no-nonsense approach and shape up or ship out attitude. And indeed, in other classes, they did lose a few people, I believe every year, who just phoned home and said, get me out of here. We did not lose any in our class, and it was said that, oh, you guys have got it easy. You know, it used to be in our good old days, we were really tough, it was tough around here. Well, I think that line of thought has been pursued by every class ever since. Mm-hmm. And as I say, I think that a dash of rigorous discipline at the beginning isn't a bad thing, but some of it was more, I'd say, almost sadistic. And however, we survived it.
You remember the obstacle course?
Well, I do particularly remember because I am one of the very, very few who never ran it. I mentioned the risk of falling downstairs, and indeed about 2 days before the obstacle course, I fell down the stairs and badly sprained my ankle. And I observed the obstacle course. I'd have to say it was very different from what it is now, and it's a sort of a cooperative thing. And in our day, it was certainly competitive. And before the race, we were paraded by the seniors and told that no one was ever left behind. Now, this was the only cooperative part of the thing. You did not leave anyone behind. And if someone is having a hard time at an obstacle, 1, 2, 3 members of the class stay with them and get them over, or under. Yes, there were unders too. And also be careful when you came to the one where the canvas was over stakes and you had to crawl through, because the riding establishment provided some of the obstacles for that. And there was oil and tar and God knows what. And it always seemed that the engineers selected that weekend to cut off the hot water while they did some kind of maintenance in the fall. Oh. And I remember her class going in exhausted and dirty, and there was always a tea dance after the thing, and they trying to get cleaned up, and all this gooey oil and horse shit on them, and cold showers. Well, there weren't showers, and no, that year there were not showers, there were baths still. So cold bath. As I say, I did not participate, and to be perfectly honest, I'm rather glad I didn't.
Now, you still were riding?
Yes. We did not ride in our recruit year. Riding started in the second year, which in those days was known as the third class. And through that whole year, for that first year of riding, we never touched the reins and we never touched the stirrups. You did touch the reins when told to, but when you mounted, you knotted the reins and dropped them on the horse's neck. And the stirrups were crossed in front of you, I guess as a sort of a reminder that times would get better later on. And there were times when there were more cadets dragging themselves up from the tanbark than there were those on the backs of horses, I think. Sometimes it was pandemonium. And there were some pretty rigorous jumps that we were put through, going over and under jumps. Not over and under, over and over, I guess they were. Although in some cases, if you fell off, you were under. There was a jump where the horse did not get a chance to make a second pace. He had to sort of bounce, and then went over another one. And so it's a total of, I think, 3 bar jumps. And you started off like this, and you had to clap your hands behind you for the second one, and then clap your hands over your head, I think it was, for the third one. This without stirrups and without reins. Now this tended to put people at high risk.
I don't know how you survived.
Well, I wonder, because more by good luck than good management, I was probably, I think I was the last survivor who hadn't come off among the tyros. We were given a certain amount of leeway, you might say, but I had not come off. But on this particular day, and it was the in and out jumps, I remember coming off spectacularly and seeing this 3-bar jump immediately in front of me, putting my arms up like that, and I knocked 2 of those bars off. I was invited to remount, And incidentally, Captain Wolf, the riding instructor, had a stock phrase when you came off, where he said quietly, but everyone could hear, "Did you get the order to dismount, Cadet Webber?" You're standing there with every bone in your body aching, tan bark all over you. "No, sir." "Well, then kindly remount." "Well, you've got to catch the damned horse to remount." And as I say, on this particular time I came off, I established a record, however, because I was invited to try again and again. I came off 4 times. No one had ever, to our knowledge, gone off more than 3 times. And then there I was, up to my ankles in tan bark, with one of the grooms having seized my horse, with which Charlie Wolf, the instructor, turned to the class and said, "Now, gentlemen, all our horses are good jumpers. It's the riders who need some education, and I will show you that this horse can jump." QMSI, whatever his name was, will jump. And he, being one of the establishment, mounted and went tearing off. And to my joy and jubilation, he ended up hanging around the neck of the horse. There were muttered clapping from my horse. No mention was ever made again from the instructor about my prowess as a rider. And at the end of the year, I was awarded something on my sleeve. I think it was crossed whips or a spur or something. So I had survived this. But if I can just go on about the riding for just a moment, I get bored about this. There was a competition at that time called the Dundonald Cup. And it was an exercise in cross-country riding based on the tactics of the mounted rifles, who were a big deal in the South African War. And we went, we formed up at the riding establishment and walked along beside Highway 2 up to Barryfield Common, then crossed the road to where the permanent buildings are now. And there is a small stream that goes through there, and there were some brushwood jumps established in and around this area, and the rifle range is there, and we had to start off by jumping the stream. Well, these horses didn't do this very often, like once a year. I think they've forgotten. And the stream, they didn't like streams. This was upsetting to them. It's also upsetting to their riders, I discovered. And I negotiated this stream along with the other members of my section. There were 4 horses to a section. And then we had to ride abreast to this brushwood jump. My horse decided that there was no sense to jumping this thing. He just walked around, cantered around it. That was a sensible thing to do, and I have to admit I kind of agreed, but that wasn't what I was allowed to do. So there was a struggle to get us all over on that all properly. We negotiated that. And then we had to stop at I think it was a 300-yard range on the range, and all in accordance with the drill, take our rifles out of the bucket, which most people would call a holster, but the thing that held the rifle in her. And number 1 gathered the reins of all the others, and everybody doubled up to the range and fired 5 rounds at a target or whatever it was, and then it came back and remounted and cantered and galloped and did all sorts of things. Well, as you know now, Navy Bay does not go anywhere near Highway 2. But in those days, it was really very close to it. It was, probably 10 or 15 feet within from the paved road. And there was just a little path along there. My horse was determined that it was going to join the traffic on Highway 2. It just did not like that lake, and we went at rather like the Lipizzaner horses, to going sideways along this walk, while traffic whizzed by and the horse wanted to join them. He didn't want to go anywhere near the lake. I kept thinking, what happens if this damn thing gets on the road? Well, it might get killed. Well, that would be okay, but I might get killed, and I didn't think that was a good idea. And once we got up to the cut, we would get away from the lake, and I assumed all would be well. But it didn't really like the whole idea. It wanted to be back in the stable. It was a skittish kind of a horse, and I remember thinking, what am I going to do if I come off in the middle of Barryfield Common? My horse is running wild and I'm on my feet, and there's no one to catch the horse, and I can't catch it. What is Captain Wolfe going to say? Was I ordered to dismount, and would I kindly remount? It didn't happen. Anyway, that's the story of riding.
I was wondering about, within the normal day, the disciplinary system, the official disciplinary system. That is not the ones that the seniors invented on the fly, but...
There was very little exercising of the official system, in the official system, because the seniors pretty well took care of that, that you had adhered to the whatever the college regulations were, etc. There were some cases of cadets actually being paraded for orderly room cases and being awarded confinement to barracks. Well, since you had to have a pass to get out, and it didn't make much difference to recruits because we never got out anyway. And what was it? Confinement to barracks, or RL, which was restricted leave. Well, I never knew what the difference was, but I never suffered those humiliations myself. I remember when I was a recruit, there was a second classman, that would be the third year, who had somehow misbehaved himself at the June ball the previous spring before we got there. RCD, I forget his last name now. Anyway, the promulgation of these punishments, in addition to being in Part 1 orders, was always read out at night by the flat orderly. A recruit was, you might call him, the general duties person who did certain prescribed things that had to be done. And one of them was to announce in a loud voice, there was no PA system, any punishments. And I can remember this man had 42 days CB, 32 days RL, and then the next night it would be 41 days CB. This went on all fall.
Now, you also had duties as cadets within the college. I've certainly heard of fire picket, and I have seen a photo of a cadet in full winter uniform with a rifle on his shoulder down at the old gate.
I wonder what he was doing.
So there was
that would be, I think that was very occasionally we did a ceremonial guard duty on the gate for church parade. I think we did it once in the winter time, or maybe more than once. And we actually had the guard consisted of 6 persons with a guard commander, and they stayed in that little house that's beside the gate. And in fact, their lunch was taken over by them, 2 of them going over to the cadet kitchen and bringing back a tray between them of food that was done there. And then when the parade went through, of course, they all turned out and various commands were read out, all very archaic. And then at the June Ball weekend, this was all done in scarlet tunics and white pith helmets, properly worn with the spike vertical. And the assembled visitors and guests were all greatly impressed by this. Oh, it's kind of a nice ceremony. Quarter guard, it was called.
Right.
Quarter guard.
But you also stood fire picket.
Well, yeah, there was a fire drill which was rehearsed about once a season, I think. Somewhere, and I can't remember where, there was a hand-pulled fire hose thing, like you see pictures of in the 19th century, you know, and half a dozen people were detailed for fire picket, and that appeared in orders, and a runner was detailed for the staff adjutant, and another for the commandant. I can't remember. There were 2 or 3 other duties, and if the siren went, there was a siren within the college grounds in those days, then the runners reported to their respective bosses, and the team turned out to haul the fire hose to wherever the fire was, if they knew where it was. The only catch in all this was that you didn't really know where the staff adjutant was going to be, nor where the commandant was. And I remember a friend of mine who was staff adjutant's runner, going around the grounds looking for him, and finally found him. And he ran up to him and reported for duty, and the staff adjutant said, "Well, who are you? What duty?" He said, "Well, I'm your runner. I'm detailed for a runner for the fire alarm." And he said, "Oh, well, you better stick around for a bit till I find out what I'm supposed to be doing." But we weren't very well protected in the matter of fire drills, I think.
Well, you know, it has been mentioned by others that there was this feeling that the military staff at the college really weren't all that aware of what was going on within the cadet wing, and didn't make much of an effort to find out.
Ken Stewart was somewhat aware, as was Bud Steen, who was staff adjutant, later became a lieutenant general. And Ken Stewart, the man who became the chief of general staff. And Ken told me, I think he told our class, he said he had tried to approach a senior cadet about what was going on in the way of bully-ragging of the recruits, etc. And he said, he described it that the cadet got a glazed look in his eye and focused on infinity and just answered, "Yes, sir, no, sir, no, it doesn't happen, sir. No, oh no, I'm not aware of that, sir." He didn't get anywhere with him. But I do believe there had been some mitigation of what was going on. You couldn't be struck with a swagger stick when I was a cadet, which apparently had been the habit sometime earlier. But by and large, the discipline was run by the seniors, no question about it.
Could I ask you, you couldn't be struck with a swagger stick, but could you be struck with a strap?
Couldn't be struck.
At all?
No, it is just like the Army Act.
Yeah.
You didn't strike any. I, however, had the pleasure of striking a senior once. My senior was a bit of an oddball, and he apparently had taken a great dislike to one of his class. And the RMC was playing a soccer game that day, I think, against, I forget whom now. And this other senior, his name was Hadley, Puffy Hadley, had done or said something, whatever it was. My senior, Jimmy Kirkpatrick, later became an Ontario judge, got me in and said, "Webber, go down and slap Corporal Hadley in the face, give him my compliments." And I looked a bit startled about this, because this fell within the gambit of the official disciplinary matter. This was striking a senior officer. And I looked a bit startled. I said, "Go ahead, get on with it." Well, it just so happened that I disliked Puffy Hadley intensely, as did many of my class. But even worse, we were vying for the favors of the same girl in Ottawa. And I caught Puffy Hadley in the bottom flat of Fort Frederick. And I can still see the scene now where I stood in front of him and said, "Sergeant Kirkpatrick's compliments," which caused him to pay attention, with which I wound up when I whacked him an open-handed blow across the chops, which almost sent him reeling. It was a great pleasure. My hand feels it even now.
What was his response?
Well, his response was an automatic one of trying to respond, but I sort of figured it wouldn't just stand there, and I was ready and ducked and didn't hit me. But nothing happened to me. But I did hear quite an altercation later on from in my senior's room where Puffy had gone up to accuse him of whatever it was.
Now, there was a thing known as the S book, the ship book.
Yes.
What was that all?
Well, we were instructed that we were to put all the information we were supposed to know about the college and its history, starting with the old 18, and what was the inscription on the front of the arch? What was the inscription on the back of the arch? What is on top of the arch? Catch question. The answer to that was loon shit. What's on the bottom of Navy Bay? Loon shit. What is the old oak bollard? You ever heard of the old oak bollard?
Oh.
Well, over just by the entrance to the old gymnasium, there used to, when I was a cadet, there was a bronze plaque at ground level just beside the sidewalk. This oak bollard was used by the ships of the Royal Navy, Great Lakes Squadron or something, for when berthed at the Navy Bay, etc., etc., etc. And until a few years before, it had been a great solid old oak bollard and had been preserved as a monument, but it had rotted. And when I was there, you could see the outline of it on the soil, and in fact there was a bit of rotten wood there, but the bollard itself had long gone. I notice now the plaque is long gone, but that's the story of the old oak bollard.
Oh. Now, pranks. You know, to get rid of frustrations, Skylarks have always been
yeah, well, I can think of, Ian Sutherland Brown, known as Soggs Brown. He was a perpetrator of a few of them, and it was he who came back from, I guess, an engineer's training camp one summer with cordite in his suitcase. It's hard to believe what he got away with. And he, along with a few of his mates, took a small German trench mortar. There was a little souvenir museum on the second floor of what is now called the academic building. I think that's what it's called. It was a little gadget. It was a very crude thing. Essentially just a metal tube mounted on what appeared to be an oak base. And they loaded this thing up. I guess it was never meant to withstand the kind of charge they put in, because there was one hell of a bang. This was after dark. And it disappeared completely. Well, they never intended to damage it. They certainly didn't intend for it to disappear. And this was done in the dark, so they couldn't do much about it. But the next day, first thing, they got out and looked around and found the tube out in the middle of the football field. There were no remnants of wood anywhere to be found. Nothing much was made of it. Bud Steen, the staff adjutant, who lived in the staff adjutant's quarters just next to the old gymnasium, was fairly tolerant of things, and he knew what was going on a great deal, but he just let it ride very, very wisely. It was also Soggs Brown who came back from somewhere with a piece of calcium carbide. You remember the stuff that used to make acetylene from?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was almost the size of a golf ball. Usually it's granular stuff, it's small grains. I don't know where he'd been that he got this. He came back to the college with this, and he'd go into someone's room and be chatting with him, and he'd surreptitiously drop this thing into the men's sink. And then as the chatting went on, he'd turn the cold tap on a little bit, and the most horrendous stink would arise. And it was acetylene gas, which sounds awful, smelly stuff. Well, this was very funny. People got to know that if Soggs Brown came into your room, keep between him and the sink. Well, one day he got into someone's room and he put this thing in the sink, and by this time it had eroded somewhat. It was getting smaller and smaller with each application. This time it went down the drain. You couldn't stop it. Whereas before he would whip it out and take it away and have a great laugh, and the damn thing went down. So for some considerable time, this was a real disaster. And I think a failed prank was, I don't know why I wasn't in on this one. It was on my company, and a very good friend of mine by the name of Ralph Lawrence, who was a really nice guy. He was out on pass. This was when we were seniors and rebellion had set in. And it was decided it would be a good idea if we took his bed apart, pushed the pieces out of the window and reassembled the bed outside the wall and hung it by his puttees, with the puttees fastened to the radiator. Well, as I say, I wasn't in on it, but I just heard about it afterwards. Those beds were heavy, and it didn't work out. They had a hard time putting it together on the outside, as you can imagine. However, they had been hanging it and assembling it, and then decided they'd better bring it in. And this they did. The only part of this was that Ralph ended up with a pair of puttees that were about 1.5 inches wide and 100 yards long, stretching down the thing.
Oh, dear.
Incidentally, Ralph went down with the destroyer we lost in the Bay of Biscay.
Athabasca?
And I always said that had he survived the war, he would have ended up either as Chief of Naval Staff or as the Primate of all Canada. He was not a Bible thumper, but he was a devout Anglican, and he would have been, I believe he would have been either one. Yeah, great guy, just a wonderful guy.
Now, at the end of your first year, summer training occurred.
Well, yes, it was not like it is now, where it's highly organized. I got a letter from the Foot Guards inviting me to join them for summer training. About the same time, my father had been asked, I guess, I don't know how it happened, that I go to summer training with the local signals militia unit here, the 3rd Divisional Signals. So I took the signals one and went away for, summer training was I think it was a 6-day affair, as I recall. Well, it wasn't very much, but I can't say I learned a hell of a lot, but it was good, healthy exercise. And of course, for most of the officers, it was great fun too. I do remember that after the final day, they had a mess dinner at the Signals Mess at Vimy Barracks, which went on quite a long time. And in the morning, very early, most of them I think had only just gone to bed, there was the most god-awful noise outside the officers' tent lines. It was the complete pipe band of the Stormont Dundasson Glengarry Highlanders, led by one of our most brilliant officers, Lord Gamble, beating the big drum. And he persuaded these people in advance that he would parade them up and down through the officers' lines before a valley after the mess dinner. It was something.
So you're telling me that the summer training side of things was not really all that seriously?
Well, it was taken seriously by, I'd say more seriously by some organizations. It wasn't compulsory to begin with. It wasn't compulsory. If you went to the signals at Vimy Barracks, you got, I think it was 6 weeks. Well, summer holidays were only 2 months, so that's about right. The Navy gave you a complete 6 weeks, I think. And I believe the Air Force did, although I don't remember much about that. The next year, because I wanted to get an engine, I wanted to go on and get an engineering degree. I went to the Signals Inspection and Test Depot, as they called it in those days, here in Ottawa to get practical shop work. I could get a credit for that. And I think most of the people after their recruit year, the following years, or many did a more constructive full summer training. But it was pretty well up to you to decide. You weren't compelled to.
Now, the fall, you go into your second year or third class, and finish up that year, and and then report back in the fall of 1939. Can you
Yes,
tell us, because that was a pretty traumatic
it
period
was
for
indeed.
you, the Decembrists.
Well,
I wonder if you could take us through that.
I drove down Spark Street here in Ottawa the day before I was to go back to RMC. I think it was the day before, maybe 2 days before. And in those days, the Ottawa Journal's offices were on Spark Street. And they used to put up bulletins outside in headline-sized print of the latest news. And I was stalled in traffic, and I remember looking out, and there was a man out there putting another bulletin up, and more of the Germans had gone into Poland. And I remember thinking, God, this does change things. Then 2 days later, I guess I was back at RMC, and of course that was the one topic, and everything went along as normal for about 2 weeks. And I guess while they were trying to adjust to it at National Defense. And then Ken Stewart had us all into to Curry Hall, and I think it was Ken Stewart, might have been the staff adjutant, I'm not sure. Then announced that commencing immediately those who were joining the forces, because they couldn't force you to join, but everybody did without exception, would be asked what their choice of service would be, and that the seniors would graduate in October, which would make us then the seniors when we came back from Thanksgiving leave. And then that we would graduate in December the 20th. It became apparent that things had changed. So suddenly there was far more interest in weapons training and more like things like that, and what to do with the gas mask and stuff like that. Incidentally, one of our class instantly took his release because he could be commissioned in the Toronto Scottish, where his father had been an officer in the First World War and of course kept it up, and there was a family connection. So Freddie McLaren went off to war with the Toronto Scots. It was the Toronto Scots, might have been the 48th Islanders, I guess it was. Other than that, the rest of us picked whatever corps or service we were going to go to. And in December, we went.
It must have been quite a shock to have come back in the fall and found that you were leaving.
Yeah, it was, and mixed feelings. By the time you've done 2 years, I guess almost any institution, you're getting a bit browned off with it. And suddenly, liberation appeared. On the other hand, you knew that this was not fooling around. And I remember just a few hours after our graduation parade, I was sitting looking over Navy Bay, waiting to pack up and go home. I remember thinking, now, of all the people that I saw on parade today, how many will I see again? And there was a number that I never saw again.
Right.
Which, these incidentally were smaller classes in those days, and you got to know people very closely. We were a band of brothers pretty well. There were a few outcasts, of course, Yes, it was an emotional
How
business.
many were in your class?
I was afraid you'd ask that question. I think we assembled at 60, and by the time we graduated, I think it was about 52 graduated. Some failure with well, I know there were 4 drops to the next class of people who failed their first year, and I think there were, well, Freddie McLaren, 2 or 3 others who made a change of career, didn't finish their. So far as I know, everyone served in uniform. These guys, well, one went off to be a doctor because it was a family tradition almost, and he went through an accelerated course at Toronto and became a doctor in the services. But he obviously didn't graduate with us. Another one failed math and was never going to pass it, so he withdrew, and he became a squadron leader during the war. I don't know what he actually did. And then I was an honorary ADC at Government House one day, and I was receiving people coming in, and there was Edmund Boyd Osler. He was an MP. He was a member of my class who had withdrawn because he's never going to pass math.
So he became an MP.
Yeah.
We must remember that.
Yeah.
I was noting in your yearbook, which of course was the yearbook for 2 classes.
Yeah.
It was Chester Hull's gang and then
That's right.
your gang.
Yeah.
And of course your class did not even get photographs in the yearbook, just a list of names.
That's right. Yeah.
And
Incidentally, we were photographed, but they didn't
didn't
appear.
use them. Yeah, very strange. I think you're the only class
Yeah.
that was never photographed. And I noticed that whoever wrote you up.
Oh, the one girl at the gramophone?
Yes.
Well, by this, as I say, everything accelerated. And by the time the notes were written for that, and of course I had nothing to do with writing it, it was well known that Peggy and I were a pair. And in fact, we were married in the springtime, 3 or 4 months later. And also, I had come back to the college with an electric gramophone, as we called them in those days. And my room became a rather popular place because I also had quite a collection of records. And the gramophone, I think, was what attracted people. In fact, it was a damn nuisance at times because it couldn't get any work done. People would drop in to have a Benny Goodman concert and things like that. And I still have many of the tunes, not the records, of course, but on my iPod here, all sorts of them that were excellent
yes.
at that time. Andrew's sister, Benny Goodman, people like that, yeah. The senior at the table would say, "Webber, prove!" And you had to put your hands out and show them that they were clean, you know. Well, since you had to blacken your boots with your fingers, you never could get your hands.
This finger was always black.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that had stopped, I gather, the year that I got there, so it didn't happen to me, but I understand that the way a senior would have his milk tumbler replenished was he'd bang it on the table and then throw it up in the air and go on talking. And a recruit somewhere had to grab this thing, fill it with milk, and pass it down the table.
Well, eventually you left the famous Decembrists, and I think I don't know whether the class ahead did Hull's class call themselves the Octobrists?
They were known as the Octobrists, yes.
Yeah, okay, and you were the Decembrists. I think you're the only 2 classes that had a special name.
Oh yeah, we were.
Like that.
Yeah.
And you all volunteered, you told me.
Yeah.
And then what happened to you?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, I went up to the School of Signals in my barracks, and I had I trained there until July, I guess it was, and then went across the road to where the 2nd Divisional Signals was forming up and getting ready to go overseas, and I was attached to them for orientation, how to be an officer. And then detached when it came time to go overseas. I went over in the same ship with the 2nd Divisional Signals, but on a draft of officers. There were about 10 of us, I think, something like that. And joined the 1st Division Signals, who had been there since Christmas of 1939, and wound up as a signal officer of the 1st Field Regiment of Artillery, the RCHA, commanded by the redoubtable Guy Simmonds.
Oh, yeah.
And I figured that I didn't really learn anything after that 6 months there, because I didn't need to. If you've been serving under Guy Simmonds, you better get it right or you are out. I remember watching one day from my billet, and a truck arrived across the road where the headquarters billet was. And 2 officers who were my classmates got out. And the adjutant, who was Baron Rothschild, came out and met these 2 officers at the truck. They were unloading their stuff. And there was some chatting, and they put their stuff back in the truck, and they went away. And I later learned that Guy Simmonds, who had an office on the 2nd floor of this billet, this is all in London, had seen who they were and despised both of them, and had simply said to the adjutant, he sent his runner down saying, "Give the adjutant my compliments and tell those officers to get back in the truck and go back where they came from." And that's what they did. One of them became the governor of Bermuda.
Oh, Teddy Leather.
Teddy Leather.
Yes.
Ted always said he hoped that a guy would come down and inspect the Navy had a listening station there, and hoped that Guy would come down sometime and pay a visit to the listening station, because protocol would have to come in and pay a call and Ted. It didn't happen.
My God. Sir Edmund Leather.
Yeah.
Yes.
EHC, Edmund Hartley Cameron Leather. He was a very controversial figure in our class. But I served with the gunners there for, it was around 6 months. This was in Bromley, Beckenham, Croydon area, and we got the bejesus bombed out. It was not that we ever suffered any casualties, but all the civilians did. And certainly the first casualty of war I ever saw was a teenage girl we dug out from the rubble of a house. It was fairly adventurous there. And then I was moved over to the 2nd Brigade headquarters, which was in a pastoral scene in the countryside. Bore, we're just out in the country. I initiated a highly illegal scheme whereby 3 times a week I used to send a 3-ton truck into Croydon laden with thirsty troops. And I laid it, incidentally, they were kind of a hard nut lot. I laid it on the line with them. I said, "No, I've got my neck out on this. You guys let me down, and it's game over. But you have the truck, the driver is not to take a single drop to drink, and if there's any untoward disturbance or anything like that, it's all over. Don't let me down." And I got hold of the sergeant. I said, "Go with them. There's always got to be one sergeant on this detail." Well, it was amazing. These guys, I had some of the unit real criminals in that outfit. They were just as nice as pussycats afterwards. Yeah, it worked. I learned a lot about man management with K-section. And in 1941, the year I would have graduated under peacetime conditions, I went to the Spitzbergen raid up at Spitzbergen, where I lived with the Norwegian operators of their weather station there, who continued to transmit weather information to Bergen. The Germans had the other end. And the deal was that they would continue and we would monitor the traffic to ensure that they didn't report that we were there. Now we had with us the Empress of Canada as a troop ship. She was a big ship. A Royal Navy anti-aircraft cruiser, Renown, I think it was. I could be wrong about that one. And 3 destroyers. I traveled from Iceland to Spitzbergen in the Icarus, Royal Navy destroyer, in advance of the expedition to seize this radio station, which was on a promontory where a fjord had its outlet to the ocean. The fjord was about, I think it was around 15 miles long, fairly narrow. And so we had in the long run a large RN ship, 3 destroyers. I think it was 2 oilers that met us there, and I don't remember much about them because I wasn't with the main. I was isolated. They were down at the end of this fjord, and there were 2 or 3 minesweepers, maybe some other odds and ends. Well, everything went smoothly. The Norwegians were definitely on our side. Kind of a low comedy landing. We landed about 4 o'clock in the morning because it was broad daylight. It was summertime, and I and my 4 operators and a Norwegian second lieutenant with 2 Norwegian soldiers was the landing party, and we were there with our weapons loaded and cocked, and the destroyer was lying off, and they towed us ashore with a powerboat into a little cleft in the cliff where there was a little landing stage, and we were prepared if the ship fired anything at the radio station, it was the signal that the radio station had started to broadcast that they were being invaded, and secrecy was over, at which point we were to grab our rifles and get out of the boat and rush the place and do or die for dear old empire. So very tense. Got to the landing jetty, couldn't see the station by this time because it was under the jetty was under the cliff. And just as I was getting everybody assembled, ready to rush up the path, a voice from above said, "Good morning, would you like some coffee?" It was the cook. He'd seen the ship lying off and come down to see what was going on. Well, then the main convoy arrived and they all went up this long fjord. There's quite a lot more to this story, but the ship and its escort were to transport a Russian colony from the base of this fjord. I forget the name of the Longyearbyen it was. Take all the Russians back to Russia, to Archangel. The Russians had a coal mining colony there. They leased rights from the Norwegians. They had the biggest settlement on the island. And then the ship and escorts were to come back and pick up us. That is to say, the main body down in the base of Longyearbyen. In the meantime, while they were away, our engineers were to destroy the mine facility and set alight 265,000 tons of coal that was lying ready to be shipped out. Well, I'd been there about 3 or 4 days, I guess. Nothing happening, everything was peaceful. Norwegians were friendly, and that was just pleasant. The chief of the station came to me one day and said, "What are you going to do on Friday?" I don't do what I'm doing now, I guess. I don't know. He said, when the German reconnaissance plane comes over. I said, "What?" I said, "Every Friday, didn't you know?" Well, I was on strict radio silence. I could not open up unless I saw enemy. So I couldn't communicate to our main body. And it just happened that the weather turned pretty foul at the time, and the little boat that the station had would not have made it to the base of the fjord, so it couldn't go by boat. So I had to figure out, do I open up and reveal that we're here, or do I stay mum and hope for the best? And I started thinking about the timing. I hadn't really been properly briefed about this because this was a new thing. But I did know about the convoy leaving Spitzbergen and going to Archangel. And I hoped I got it right, because I figured if they could get out into the open sea before the recce plane came over, then they'd be quids in. And I did get it right. They sailed out, I remained on radio silence, no German activity, and as it happened, this foul weather was a godsend. It wasn't foul by this time, but the station manager came and said to me, "I can fake the weather reports, but only for a short time, because it will become apparent that there's something anomalous here." So I had to make the decision, do we try this or not? So I told him, go ahead and try it. As it happened, that weather, as I say, did deteriorate. And as far as the meteorologists in Bergen were concerned, we just happened to get a bit of it early, and nothing happened. 5 days later, the convoy came back and picked us all up, and off we went back to England, and our escort then disappeared halfway there and went up and shot up the Lofoten Islands. That was Admiral Vian.
Oh, yes.
He liked to shoot up places. And no, that happened in 1941. In it would be about 1964, I guess, 63. I was heavily involved with NATO at this end, and I had a committee meeting of some kind here where Canada was to be the host and I was front and center. And I had the foreigners, well, most of the people actually, come to our house for a gargle and a giggle. And at that time I had in the hall something that referred, framed pictures or some, I don't know what it, I can't remember what it was, but it referred to Spitzbergen. And the German was looking at this and he said, what is this? Why would you have this? And I said, oh, I told him the story. He said, you? I said, yeah. He said, I was on the other end of that radio link. He said, we wondered for days what had gone on.
Small world.
Small world.
Oh, that's crazy.
My Lord.
And then I landed in Sicily on D-Day with the 2nd Brigade. I went through Sicily and then moved up to division headquarters and had a about a year and a half, I guess, at division headquarters, and then moved over for the last 8 months of the war to Corps headquarters. So I got further and further away from the action. However, I wasn't complaining. I'd seen enough of it anyway. And made it home, and I think it was the 28th of June 1945 that I got home to meet my son, whom I had never met before, and he was 4.5 years old again.
Oh, goodness.
He died about 6 months later. And that was life.
My goodness. Tell me, your time with the old brigade, we've just suddenly begun to take an interest in what's been going on with the club, and in particular the old brigade. It's just kind of been there. And I wonder, you took over from Bennett,
Yeah.
whom I knew quite well, and I wondered if you could tell us something about what it was like to be adjutant of the old brigade during your time.
Well,
Laid out.
First of all, you've got to go back a little bit. The old brigade was just a notional thing that invented by Donnie Agnew. And you know the story about the class of, what was it, 1914, who decided on the 50th anniversary that those who had survived would meet, and then, because there weren't many who had survived, they decided they wouldn't invite anybody who's more than 50 years, etc. And Donnie Agnew arranged for the class originating this idea to live in their old rooms at the frigate. And in their dinner, he was congratulating them and talking it over. And I gather, rather as an aside, said, he said, I think you ought to try to perpetuate this. It's a great idea. Why don't you call yourselves the Old Brigade? It was a casual thing. And they had a meeting and decided they'd have an old brigade. Had to, 50 years after a year of entry, there'd be a brigade commander, there'd be a quartermaster, and there'd be a brigade major. Well, they never selected a quartermaster, and if they did, I don't know what the hell he'd do. And they never selected a brigade major, because they weren't going to fight anybody. And they ended up with an adjutant of the old brigade, who did organize things, made sure there was a table for them in the general dinner. They weren't separated in any way. As I say, it was a notional thing. When the ex-cadets had dinner in the cadet mess, the old brigade had a couple of tables at the far end away from the kitchen. Well, as time went on, the dinner in the cadet mess became bigger and bigger and noisier, and the service became worse and worse. And the members of the old brigade got more and more pissed off with the whole thing. It wasn't what they wanted, and they took to organizing a dinner of their own at a restaurant downtown. No, I wasn't in on any of this. Then, and I guess it was in Bob's time, they decided to have a dinner in the senior staff mess. I guess the senior staff mess had just been built. Yeah, that was it, just been built. So that separated the old brigade and became a visible thing that they were over there and the rest of us were the cadet mess. And later, the rest of us were over at the rec center across the road as it got bigger and bigger. Just towards the end of Bob's, oh, and I should just add something here. The ladies, in the meantime, who came for the weekend, were ignored. There was nothing for them, and never was any intention. But some of the ladies in Kingston, Puss Watsford was one of them, did try to arrange something. Well, that wasn't exactly a hell of a good idea. You can imagine these women didn't know each other, and they were kind of pissed off that their husbands were off doing what husbands do, and there they were staring at each other in a commercial restaurant. So I gather there was a bit of chuntering that went on, but the thin end of the wedge had happened. Something had been done about the women. So within a fairly short time, it was decided that a dinner would be organized for the women in the senior staff mess in what's known as the Coggins room now. And so they would be looked after there, and then when our dinner was over, and their dinner, we'd eat in the mess and gone. Well, at this point my wife was going to it, and apparently it was pretty badly organized, or badly run. She said a great hairy arm with a tattoo would come and put soup in front of her. The guy was wearing a dirty T-shirt, it was just terrible. So the chuntering got louder, but nothing was done about it. And we held the fort, and then there came the time when the mess was to be refurbished and was not available. And Fort Frontenac was available, but Fort Frontenac said they couldn't do two dinners under one roof. No, I deny this. I know Fort Frontenac. I lived in Fort Frontenac, and I know what it's got. Something fishy is there. So the ladies were, from having been organized and had their dinner in the military facility, suddenly they were out in the cold again. But instead of leaving them out in the cold, which I'll admit was a tough one, Bob said, well, the mess room, dining room in Fort Frontenac is big enough for all of us. So just because of that, we would, for this occasion, have the ladies there, which we did. Of course, this changed the whole character of the thing, and I'm not saying it was a bad thing, but it was a different thing. Well, as we closed dinner, some idiot stood up and said, Mr. President, before we leave, a word. This has been such a successful dinner having the ladies here. I move that we do this every year from here on. I like to hear some people support this note. A few drunken idiots. The next thing we knew, it was there. Well, that's the basis of what it is now. In the meantime, the big post-war classes have moved in. They've reduced the age for entry into the old brigade, which has no significance now. And we can't even fit any more into this Lorenzo place out on the road. I think they said, what was it, 280 with present, some figure like that.
Yeah, last year was the biggest. It was bigger than this year, and it was getting up towards 270, I think.
Something like that.
The senior staff mess cutoff was, we pushed the envelope at 230, and I was running it, or helping run it the last year we had it in the senior staff mess, and we outgrew it.
Yeah, I knew because I went through an agony where we had to move furniture out. As people came in the door, we were moving furniture into nooks and crannies. Well, when I joined the old brigade, I think probably something in the order of 45 people were at the dinner. Our class members and our senior class members, those of us who were survivors or went to the dinner. It was an intimate affair with people you knew, some of whom you hated, but that was okay too. It was just a very heartwarming thing.
Your dinner when you joined would have been the fall of 1987.
Yes.
That was the year that the first woman attended your dinner. The cadet wing commander.
Yes, oh yeah, I see. Sorry, I thought you meant she was next guy. No. Yes, you're quite right.
And Bob Bennett had quite a time because he and I had a long discussion because he wasn't quite sure how he was going to finesse this in a dinner which had been entirely male since year one. And of course she was such an amazing young lady, I gather you all fell in love with her anyway.
She carried it off very well, and nobody was going to question Bob Bennett anyway. As I say, since then, well, I go out of a sort of a sense of duty, because I know I hardly see anyone I ever knew anymore. That happens. Usually Britt Smith is there, and I know him. He was a class below me, and I certainly know him. None of the members of my class are there.
Yeah, Bill Turner is always there.
Bill Turner was always there. Well,
how was your role when you took over? What was the role of the adjutant within the ex-cadet weekend, the Saturday ceremonies and the Sunday parade?
Well, he organized the old brigade squadron for the church parade, and that was a bit of a chore, and selected the member of the old brigade who was going to take the salute for the church parade, and tried to get him there at the saluting base at the right time. I remember once going around that square nearly desperate. I couldn't find my man to get on that. It was Ted Beeband, and we'd all gathered in a certain place. Ted had been there, and he disappeared. I went looking for him. I couldn't see him. Anybody said Ted Beeband? No. Well, the reason why he was so keen to take the salute, he was up there on the saluting base. And he was a charming guy, and when I found him, I said, "Oh my God, thank God you're here." And I told him I was looking for him. He said, "Well, I should have told you. I apologize." And he said, "Mike, you've just given me the proudest moment of my life." Well, I figured it was all okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, when you were a cadet, the reunion weekend had been around for quite a while. What's your recollection of how it went when you were a cadet?
Well, we didn't have much to do with it, but, well, I shouldn't say it. It was in the springtime, and we trooped the color on that occasion. 200 of us, it was a fairly thin parade. And incidentally, there were some very good movies made of it, and I've never been able to trace them.
Really?
Mm.
Yeah, they were made by Ack Fleming, and they were color movies.
Right.
And I saw them a year later at the old badminton club in Kingston, where we had an ex-cadet dinner, and this movie was produced there.
Fleming. Ack.
A.C.K. Well, he was known as Ack. I don't know what his.
He was A.C.K. Fleming, and he.
I don't know whether those were his initials. So he was he was known as Ack Fleming.
What year would he?
He was in the same year as Bob Bennett. He entered in 1935, and he ended up as a wing commander in the RAF. He stayed with the RAF. He came over for I guess perhaps it was their entry to the old brigade, I don't remember. But I do remember seeing him and chatting with him on the square.
But he ended up living in the UK.
Yeah.
So if we were to try and chase those down, we'd be going after a family that was in the UK.
Yes, I think so. He was an acquaintance of mine. I didn't know him well. The duties of the adjutant. Well, one of my duties, which I took, well, as Bob said when he says you can do whatever you like as the adjutant of the old brigade. You can make a big deal out of it, or just fiddle around with it. And don't forget, Penny House is there to help you. So I took it upon myself to communicate with all the branches and ask them to appoint someone to be their liaison officer with members of the old brigade in their particular area, and to try to make one occasion each year an occasion to bring the old brigade in. I raised funds to have the photographs of the fallen in the memorial staircase to be refurbished, and for lighting to be improved, which is something I had not wanted to do really, because I didn't want the old brigade to become a separate organization. I wanted to be just recognized for what it was, people with 50 years or more of service. And in my letter, I said this is the only time I'll ever ask for oh yes, in closing my letter to the members of the old brigade on the subject of the photographs, say to yourself as you read this and consider sending us some money, there but for the grace of God hang I. I got a lot of money. We did the job. We didn't change the lighting though, but other things were done.
Right.
It was against my principles really to have the old brigade singled out. On the other hand, everyone there, everyone hanging there, would have been a member of the old brigade by this time.
Yes.
And I figured it was a special interest.
Yes.
And I used to organize the dinner, and I'd go down to Kingston and talk it over with what's his name, de Beaumont in the mess, and the hotel. I got the basics done. De Beaumont carried a lot of it for me, and Penny House did a lot for me.
Right. Well, is there anything else? Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I'll probably think of something at midnight tonight.
Yeah, undoubtedly I will too.
Just to return to one thing, I really would like to see discipline shaped up a bit. I wish I gather that they even have an option for living in town.
That will disappear at the end of this year.
Well,
yes, according to the commandant.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That doesn't lend anything to discipline. I don't suppose we can do anything about table manners.
But we are.
We have been asked by the commandant if we, as the ex-cadets, would take on the job of lecturing as part of the military training lecture series. If we would come in and educate today's cadets on history and traditions within the college, which they know nothing about, and etiquette. So stand by. You can tell them about throwing the glass of milk in here.
Yeah, I mean, they might want to adopt it.
But that's quite a remarkable thing to come out of the commandant.
Yeah.
He would like to engage the ex-cadets actively in part of the training of today's cadets.
Well, you know, in my day, the orderly officer always ate in the mess at noon.
Yes.
And he had the company commanders there with the seniors there. So he had some inkling of what went on, but there was no nonsense about etiquette. I can see Bill Newsom now looking at some hapless recruit and saying, "You don't chew with your mouth open," and the cadet said something like, "Yes," and "You don't speak with your mouth full." It was also Bill Newsom on Friday. We always got fish on Friday, and it was terrible. And Osler, the man I mentioned to you, who was a Catholic, and I remember Bill looking at this dead fish on his plate, and he happened to look up, and there's Osler picking away at his vegetables and not eating his fish. He said, "Osler, are you not eating your fish?" "No." "You're a Dogan, aren't you?" "Yes." "Eat your goddamn fishes because of goddamn Dogans, and I'm eating the goddamn fish. So goddamn you get on and eat every bloody bit of your goddamn fish." He gobbled it all down. Well, maybe not etiquette, but it was certainly effective.
Oh, it's been fun doing this. Thank you so much for
Well, not at all. It's been
giving
fun
us
for me.
so much of your time. I mean, we've been